Okay, so I think this will be the last video of this lecture. And in this video, what I'm trying to communicate to you is that we end up from this journey, this video, where we started around here on setting reality and we end up in the methodology. So now that's what I want to communicate to you. What about the methodology? What is the connection between the philosophical stance and the methodology? So the connection, the relationship is critical and it's super important. I think that it is a critical aspect because you have to be coherent again. That's a word that I keep repeating, but it's important because otherwise, if your research design is not coherent, it's not a valid research. It can lead to inconclusive or wrongful or confusing conclusions that or your contribution can be out of scope, and maybe you won't even answer to your research question. So being coherent is critical, is super important. And why is it important? And this, I think these three questions are also very, very relevant to your thesis, because you need to answer, why did you choose this paradigm? Like, why did you decide to do a positivist oriented research? So you need to justify that in your thesis. I think that at least in one paragraph, at least you should explain why your research phenomenon or the phenomenon from your research is oriented to any of the paradigms that you are choosing. And then also in the methodology, at least one paragraph about connecting the research question to the methodology. Like you need to inform the reader, like, this is my research, something like this. I think this is quite clear, right? It's kind of a storyline that is clear, like, this is my question, this is my assumption, this is my epistemological assumption of how to build knowledge, and in the end, this is my method. So kind of the same thing, but in your thesis. This point number 3. And in the end, limitations, because there are limitations for everything, but usually limitations, we write them in the conclusion. Maybe it's kind of a strategic thing, like you leave the limitations until the end and not in the methodology, but that's how it's written. And in the end, there is always not a clear answer to the previous 3 questions. So it is very vital that you explain this in your research, right? Like, I personally had a lot of problems with this in my PhD thesis. I don't know why. I still don't know why that happened. I spent like 1 year writing my methodology section, something that I'm not really that proud. Maybe I took it too seriously, and maybe this was something important that stopped my my writing. But just write it, like just do something like this in your thesis, right? Like, this is my question, this, of course, this is my assumption ontologically and epistemologically, and that leads me to my methodology, and you are done. So 2 important concepts, again, concepts. If you have your notebook with you, take it out or picture or do something. 2 very important things that you need to clarify. What is methodology and what is method? Because I think this is a big question. So I keep telling, I think I have been using the words, like sometimes I say method and sometimes I say methodology, because they are very similar, but let's state the differences. The methodology is the strategy that you follow to answer your research question. So it's a strategy, right? It's the everything, like from the data collection, from defining the paradigm, the philosophical stance, from everything that is related to answer to your research question is the methodology. It should be consistent and coherent, again, because it's a strategy, it should be coherent, right? Like, don't move between paradigms or anything like that. And it needs to be connected to the research paradigm and research philosophy. It's basically this, right? That you have all of this connected. And examples of methodologies are case study methodology, experimental methodologies. We're going to check some of them. And the method, and so that was methodology, the strategy, right? Like everything, the process, the system, right? But method is a practical tool that you use to collect, analyze, and interpret the data. It is a part of the methodology, right? So if the methodology is like a chain, a method is like each part of the chain, right? And the method, it also needs to have a reason and an objective to be in there. Like, you you shouldn't just throw methods randomly. And I will give you an example that I have seen in student thesis. Examples of methods are surveys, for example, interviews. We have like cloud-based surveys, so surveys that are online, like Google Forms. Semi-structured interviews, when I will also talk about, especially Brian, I think will talk about, or Emma, about semi-structured interviews, but it's a way to do an interview. But I told you that be careful on the reason and objective of including a method, because I've seen that students sometimes just randomly throw methods in their methodology section. Like they say like, yeah, we're going to do interviews and we are going to analyze financial reports, and we are going to also check newspapers for press releases, and we are also going to do a focus group. And then doesn't make sense. Why? Where is the reason or the objective of doing so many, of using so many methods? Is that really part of your methodology? So you have to be to be careful with that. So remember, methodology is the whole system, the whole strategy, and method is the actual tool that you use to collect or analyze or interpret data. So now back to methodologies, back at the strategies that are associated with positivism. We have at least these four methodologies. There are more, but these are the most popular. And if I think about it, I think surveys is maybe the most popular in business administration, and the use of data sets, which can be in here and in here in longitudinal and cross-sectional studies, because sometimes you already have the data set. Like, for example, if you want to study the factors that affect the stock market in China, I don't know, for a sustainable company, something like that, then you don't need to use surveys. You don't have to do an experiment, but maybe you can use cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. A longitudinal study is a study where you have data that moves through time. So you have data of day 1, day 2, day 3, or month, January, February, blah, blah, blah. That's a longitudinal study. And a cross-sectional study is when at the same point of time, you have data from different things. Like, for example, today in the morning at 8 a.m., you have the prices of every stock in the Chinese market. So you have the price of stock A, stock B, you have Lenovo, you have Huawei, you have Xiaomi, you have the different prices for each company. That's cross-section. And then in the end, you can mix these two, cross-section and longitudinal studies. So longitudinal and cross-section. So you have the price of every company in the stock market in China, but also per day, right? So that's longitudinal and cross-section. So a study that analyzes this kind of data sets can be longitudinal, cross-sectional, or mixed, or you can build your own data set by using surveys. I will also teach you this in, I think it's lecture 6 and 7, how to collect data and how to analyze data. Quite a challenge, but we will try. I'm not going that deep in here because, again, we have lectures for all of this, so don't worry that much right now. And then we also have methodologies associated with interpretivism. And I think that the most common of all of this is the case study. Again, we are going to talk about the different methodologies that are related to interpretivism, but most of what we are going to do is basically case study. So case study is when you study a specific phenomenon, and usually a specific organization, or it can be a comparative case study when you study more than one organization, and you analyze the process, you go into detail, you understand what's happening in that organization. But we are going to go in detail in there. And all of these are other interesting methodologies related to interpretivism, but I think that for a thesis, this is the most practical or used, maybe grounded theory too. We're going to talk about that, don't worry. Because in an ethnography is when you become part of the phenomenon that you are studying. Like, imagine that you are studying like this, the multicultural board, right? Like this question, the multicultural board. So an ethnography will mean that you become part of the board, right? And you should be different from the main culture in the board, right? To be part of that. That is an ethnography when you become part of what you are studying. So sometimes that's difficult for a thesis, right? Maybe you don't have enough time to do that. So I think here we are done with the slides. I think that this is a good introduction to this philosophy of research. I hope that you understand it. But in the lecture that we're going to have, I can go into more detail, and of course, I would like if you also come with questions about it. So that's the end of this lecture number 4.